On election night, Connecticut Democrats increased their already strong numbers at the state capitol. They now have an overwhelming majority in the state house and a two-thirds majority in the state senate. But when Governor Lamont was watching those results come in, he may have been hoping his own party wasn't quite so successful.
Joining us this morning, two people who can explain this counterintuitive dynamic. Keith Phaneuf, state budget reporter for the Connecticut Mirror, and Brian Durand of Intersect Public Solutions, a former chief of staff to Governor Daniel Malloy. Good morning, Brian. You in the Malloy administration, you dealt with 4 different legislatures, many more Democrats at the beginning than at the end. How did that change how you dealt with the legislature?
Well, first, I will say thank you for having me on. I certainly appreciate that it does change. I will say at the end of the day, the very basic logic that it is generally better to have more members of your own party in the General Assembly does always hold true. You need to get votes for bills that the administration and the governor are trying to pass. And it is, again, generally speaking, easier to find those votes within your own party. Having said that, I think it's also important to keep in mind that the makeup of the caucuses is really one factor of many that are going to impact the landscape of any given session. Most of those factors are outside of the governor's control. So in addition to the size of the caucuses, it's the economy. It is now very often the budget here in Connecticut, but it's also social and policy discussions that are happening around the country that are playing out also here in Connecticut. The question for a governor is it comes down to how do you create a strategy and navigate that landscape in hopefully a way that allows you to sell your ideas and your policies to the general public. In terms of what is within your control, that means using the podium and using your voice in a way that is hopefully going to garner support first within that caucus and within those caucuses, I should say, but then also with the public in order to bring pressure to bear on the process and hopefully get your priorities moving.
Hey, Keith, when you see the current dynamic, how do you see it playing out? What do you see being challenging for Governor Lamont with this setup?
Well, this is going to come as no shock. I do see the budget is going to be a big challenge, and not necessarily because I think he's at risk of being overridden in this area. The Democrats would still need all of their conservative members in the House and a handful of Republican votes to pull that off. And I just don't see that happening. But that doesn't mean they can't cause problems if they get frustrated as the numbers. Don't forget, when people win elections, they come in with wish lists and their hopes go up. In Governor Lamont's first term, the Democrats passed legislation in committee, never got any farther, but to basically take control of the bond commission, to grab the credit card away from the governor, and everything got smoothed out, but he knows that's there, and they've reminded him. I'm sure Brian can tell you with Governor Malloy, the Democrats would, if they couldn't get their way, they'd say, fine, we want you to come up with $600, $800 million a year in cuts. And by the way, we're going to give you very little guidance on how to achieve it. And they can dump that problem and say, well, if you won't let us have their way, you get to be hated right at the same time you're potentially running for re-election.
Right.
Brian, how much do rivalries between the House and the Senate, not necessarily between Republicans and Democrats, but just those two chambers, how much do they play into a governor's calculations? Because those are often played out outside the public attention.
You're absolutely right. The calendar and timing is everything in a legislative session. It's why the minority party uses that calendar to their advantage wherever they can. But you're right, even beyond that dynamic between parties, there's a dynamic between chambers. It's often the case that a bill that is, certainly that is contentious in a given year, neither chamber wants to take it up first for fear that they will do something politically risky and then the other one will not follow suit and they will have done something without necessarily, quote unquote, needing to. I think that you're right, that plays out largely behind the scenes. So again, I go back to what are those tools that an administration can go to try and move things along? Because certainly in the executive, you're watching the legislative process play out. And no matter who the governor is, he or she is going to be frustrated at times watching that. I think those personal relationships really matter from the governor and to the leaders. I think that at a staff level, having folks who can try and help move things along as well and shake it loose. I also think thinking ahead and planning and just knowing that those log jams are going to come. So the earlier you can get your initiatives moving, sometimes it's not the worst thing in the world when things slow down if you've gotten done what you want to get done already.
Keith, do you anticipate a lot of pressure on Governor Lamont from the progressives in the Democratic caucuses to raise the state income tax?
I absolutely think there will. I want to qualify that by saying I think Governor Lamont will resist it, and he'll really press the Speaker-elect Matt Ritter and the President Pro Tem Marty Looney to sort of sit on that pressure. But think about this. A couple of years ago, candidate Ned Lamont campaigned on a big pledge to deliver income tax relief to the middle class. That was his shield against Bob Stefanowski's pledge to take away somehow miraculously the entire state income tax. Ned Lamont was a little more cautious and said, I'll get about $400 million a year to the middle class by raising the property tax credit. He got in office. He didn't do it. In fact, not only did he not do that, he killed a committee proposal to raise income taxes on the wealthiest households' capital gains. And over the last 6 months, he's gone from saying, we'll be broke by the end of this fiscal year too. I'll still have $2 billion in the bank. He's going to have a hard time making the case against some form of tax redistribution. But I think he sincerely believes in the wealth flight theory. And I think no matter what, he won't cave in that area.
Wealth flight, meaning if we raise taxes on the wealthy.
On the rich.
Yeah, okay.
People will leave. Yeah. Brian, as someone who negotiated between chambers and among legislators, did you find it was a lot easier to get them to support borrowing than to raise taxes?
I think the short answer to that is yes, just because there is a common understanding between parties that borrowing, bonding is an appropriate function of government. So both parties are going to make requests for bonding initiatives that they care about and want it to be taken up by the bond commission. I think the really ultimate question on borrowing should always not be do we or don't we, but why are we borrowing in a given year? Is it the right time to do it? Certainly, there are arguments right now that there are historically low interest rates. I think both parties would agree that Connecticut has real infrastructure needs. So if you can make the conversation about that, I think that's your best bet.
Brian, thank you very much. Keith, thank you. Great having you guys on here. We appreciate your perspective. And that's it for this edition of Face the State. Coming up, CBS Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley.
And join us again next Sunday when we'll invite more guests to Face the State.